This is the Glenn Beck program. I cannot believe we have this guy on just based on his last name, Cotton. What does that make you think of? You think... Anyway, we have Senator Tom Cotton on with us now, who has said just things that should not be said at the New York Times. Things that, I think most people agree with. But you can't say those things anymore. Senator, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Glenn. Good to be on with you.
So, Senator, I have to tell you, the world has gone insane. The left, the media. I heard the New York Times today talking about how having a serious conversation with somebody about, so what happens when you get rid of the police in Minnesota? Well, we don't know exactly yet, but we're going to work it out, and it's going to be great. I mean, we're talking about major U.S. cities just saying, I'm done with the police. This is nuts.
Yeah. Glenn, this is what happens when you have a newsroom like the New York Times apparently does, or a city like Minneapolis and its mayor that are run by people who think the real world is a social justice seminar on a college campus.
Right.
I can tell you what
exactly
happens.
Right.
I can tell you what happens when you don't have the police. You have anarchy. I mean, you literally have anarchy because there is no common authority to both enforce the law and be constrained by the law. That's what will happen in Minnesota or in some of these other major cities where the Democratic mayors and city councils are talking about slashing police budgets like in Los Angeles and New York. The police are what stand between civilization and anarchy. And we need police departments that are well-funded, well-resourced, well-trained.
Senator, I cannot believe, wait a minute, I cannot believe we're having this conversation. You don't have to tell me or anybody in this audience. I'm just listening to you saying, police departments are important. Or, of course they are. Of course they are. I just can't believe that we are here at this point. Go ahead.
Look, Glenn, at what happened with the New York Times. So, as you said, the New York Times is in total meltdown, and it has suffered an internal collapse because its senior leaders decided to publish an opinion from a Republican senator that is shared by 58% of the American people. But apparently they view that as beyond the pale in the woke newsroom. Now, I would say that the senior leaders cravenly surrendered to the woke mob at the New York Times. On Wednesday of last week, they published my op-ed. On Thursday, they publicly defended it. On Friday, they renounced it after the mob demanded that. And then on Sunday, the owner of the New York Times fired the editorial page editor. I would say that he surrendered to the woke mob, but let's remember, this guy is a woke child himself.
I know he is. They're eating their own. Yeah. I mean, Senator, a lot of people are getting very upset right now. A lot of people on the right, they're getting upset and they're like, this has got to stop. I'm actually ready to grab a bowl of popcorn. I'm interested in just watching them just devour themselves. It's phenomenal what is happening. And I don't think that there is, watching Nancy Pelosi do the stunt she did yesterday is hysterical.
Yeah,
hysterical.
So, Glenn, the New York Times is making a fool of themselves, from A.G. Sulzberger all the way down to their young interns who were demanding heads on pikes because their editorial page editor had the audacity to publish an opinion with which they disagreed, although 58% of Americans agreed with it. And people are laughing at them. Reporters from other newspapers, producers from television shows, or even reporters at the New York Times recognize that the New York Times has become a laughingstock and exposed itself for what it is, a far left-wing propaganda outfit.
It couldn't happen to a nicer bunch of people. So one of the things they had a problem with...
Glenn, look at the replacement of the editorial page editor. Just take a look at her Twitter feed. But in the meantime, look at the note she sent out to her workers just a couple days ago. She said that if you see anything at all, anything that offends you or that concerns you, then just send me a text or an email right away. I mean, she is telling grown-ups people who should recognize they're not in a college campus, they're not in a social justice seminar, that they get trigger warnings at work. So they're not offended by microaggressions. I mean, this really is the language of campus children brought to the workforce, when grown-ups should be able to say, look, you're not in a social justice seminar anymore. You are in the real world. And when you're confronted with an opinion with which you disagree, the proper answer is to refute it with better arguments in return. It's not to curl up in the fetal position, demand trigger warnings, and say that the bad people that publish this opinion should be fired. And if you don't like it, you can quit.
So tell me, they said that one of the problems is they had a real problem with your depiction, which was completely inaccurate, of the role of Antifa in the protests. Tom. Do you have any evidence at all that Antifa is playing any role in this?
Well, I'll just say the Attorney General has repeatedly pointed this out, and I don't know many peaceful protesters and demonstrators who take crowbars with them to marches. I don't think stacks of bricks get into the street by themselves, Glenn. Of course, there were agitators and extremists who hijacked and infiltrated protected First Amendment protests for their own purposes. That was happening the weekend after last, and that's why you saw so much violence on the streets in places like Minneapolis and New York and Washington, D.C. Now, since the president demanded that the National Guard be on the scene in Washington, D.C., employed a lot of the specialized law enforcement units that are present around the seat of our national government. Since some Democratic governors, like Tim Walz in Minnesota, recognized that he had no choice but to call out the National Guard, that violence diminished significantly over the course of last week, to the point where over this past weekend, it was almost all just protests and demonstrations. And that's because those agitators and extremists realized that the authorities were now onto their techniques and that they faced the risk of pushback from the police and ultimately arrest and charges.
So I saw an interview with Attorney General Barr, and he said they asked him, why haven't you made a single arrest yet of Antifa if you know that they were involved? And he said something pretty shocking, at least to me. He said, because we're tracking their funding. They're very well funded right now. He's not going after the guys on the streets. He's going after the leadership. He's going after most likely, the white anti-capitalist socialists around the world that have tons of money that are funding these things. That's going to be a bombshell if he hits that, because there will be all kinds of connections to people we know.
That's Glenn. That's the right way to approach a radical organization like Antifa. I'll say that. I don't want to get too far into the details of what may or may not be investigated and what techniques our federal government is using, but there's a long history of our federal government trying to identify informants within criminal organizations and conspiracies, to roll them up and end up not just getting the foot soldiers out on the street, but all the way up to the kingpins and the funders. That was how a U.S. Grant took down the original version of the KKK in the 1870s. Mm-hmm. That's how we took down the mob in the 50s and 60s and 70s, drug gangs in the 80s and 90s, terrorist organizations over the last 20 years. The federal government has a long record of rolling up large organizations through careful investigative work and the use of informants and intelligence, and that's what we should be doing with Antifa right now.
So, Senator, if you see how the Soviet Union after World War II flipped Czechoslovakia and Hungary and everything else, they did it without a shot being fired. And it really is the bottom-up, top-down, inside-out thing. You put communists in the government, in a deep state, if you will. Then you fund and you support rioters on the streets. The people rise up and say the government's got to do something, and that deep state-controlled government comes down, and you lose your country and you lose your freedom. They did it over and over and over again, and I believe it's exactly what is happening here in the United States. How are we doing on the investigation into the deep state and all of the people that were responsible for the Russia collusion garbage ratting out and finding these people that are working against freedom in America, in our own government?
Well, we're moving forward a little bit more slowly than I would like, Glenn, but it is moving forward, in part because we lived through 2+ years of the Mueller investigation, even though I think it's now clear that the FBI knew from the earliest days, even before Bob Mueller was appointed as a special counsel, that the Steele dossier was full of garbage, probably full of Russian intelligence disinformation,
Sure.
And that there was no collusion. Whatever efforts Russia undertook on its own, there was no collusion with the Trump campaign. I commend the Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney in Washington for dropping the charges against Mike Flynn. They shouldn't have been brought to begin with, and that was long overdue. We've seen other reports, for instance, from the Inspector General in the Department of Justice about how the senior FBI leaders abused their authority in 2016 and 2017. Of course, John Durham is continuing to investigate the entire origins of the Russia collusion hoax, and I expect that'll be announced well before the election. And, of course, Lindsey Graham in the Senate has begun a series of hearings that will end up calling in some of the central players involved in those decisions, like Jim Comey and Andy McCabe, Peter Strzok, and Lisa Page. Now, nearly all of them MSNBC or CNN contributors.
Yeah. The president's poll numbers, depending on who you look at, and I don't believe them at this point, and I can't imagine America going for a group of people that are supporting what's happening on the streets, but, whatever. America is a different place now, I guess. But this is important for these things to be cleared up before the president leaves office. We would have really dangerous people coming in, and if the American people don't see some arrests and don't, we're not cleaning things up, I worry what's coming next.
Well, that's one reason why I'm confident, Glenn, that these investigations will reach their natural conclusion before January or even before the election. The Attorney General recognizes that this is a closely divided country when it comes to electoral politics. We had a split decision in 2018 with Democrats winning the House and Republicans winning the Senate. I think this will be a closely contested election as well. It's important, though, that electoral politics, whoever wins the election, not get in the way of uncovering the truth about what is perhaps the biggest political scandal in our country's history, which is the Obama administration's efforts to disrupt the peaceful transition of power and use the organs of law enforcement against its political opponents.
So, one last thing, because you were on the coronavirus early, and there's a lot of people now that look at what's happening with the medical community coming out and saying, well, racism is a much worse disease than coronavirus, so you can go protest. These mayors and these governors that were arresting people, that said that people who were protesting the shutdown were irresponsible, going to kill everybody's grandmother, they were anarchists, et cetera, et cetera. Those people are now marching in the streets. The coronavirus experts are really endorsing going ahead and rioting or at least marching in the streets. And I think there's a lot of people that say, wait a minute, we destroyed our economy. For what? Did you people even believe this ever?
Well, Glenn, I hope and I pray that we will not see a surge in coronavirus cases and ultimately deaths because of the large-scale protests and demonstrations over the last couple of weeks. We'll know in the weeks ahead. I hope that's not the case. And if it's not, then that might give us even more confidence to get the rest of our economy back up and open again. However, I think it's obvious that just de facto, the lockdowns are now in effect over. It's going to be very hard for any governor or mayor to tell his or her people, you've got to stay at home, you can't earn a living, you can't open your business, you can't take your kids to a park, you can't go worship in church, after they've seen these very same mayors and governors not just permit but encourage and celebrate protests and demonstrations with people marching in the streets shoulder to shoulder by the thousands. I would also suspect that to the extent those governors and mayors try to enforce those lockdowns, against, say, churches holding services, that they're going to face lawsuits, and those lawsuits are apt to be successful. I mean, it can't be the case that we condone First Amendment activity by the thousands in our streets, but we prohibit First Amendment activity by the dozens in our churches.
Yep. Senator Tom Cotton, thanks for being on. My gosh.